that it was not to be doubted but he had gained very greatly upon the heart of this gallant young man. And the captain, in return of all these mighty favours, besought the prince to honour his vessel with his presence, some day or other at dinner, before he should set sail, which he condescended to accept, and appointed his day. The captain, on his part, failed not to have all things in a readiness, in the most magnificent order he could possibly, and the day being come, the captain in his boat, richly adorned with carpets and velvet cushions, rowed to the shore to receive the prince, with another longboat, where was placed all his music and trumpets, with which Oroonoko was extremely delighted, who met him on the shore, attended by his French governor, Emoinda, Behn, and about 100 of the noblest of the youths of the court. And after they had first carried the prince on board, the boats fetched the rest off, where they found a very splendid treat, with all sorts of fine wines, and were as well entertained as 'twas possible in such a place to be. The prince, having drunk hard of punch and several sorts of wine, as did all the rest, for great care was taken they should want nothing of that part of the entertainment, was very merry and in great admiration of the ship, for he had never been in one before, so that he was curious of beholding every place where he decently might descend. The rest, no less curious, who were not quite overcome with drinking, rambled at their pleasure fore and aft, as their fancies guided them, so that the captain, who had well laid his design before, gave the word and seized on all his guests, they clapping great irons suddenly on the prince, when he was leaped down into the hold to view that part of the vessel, and locking him fast down, secured him. The same treachery was used to all the rest, and all in one instant, in several places of the ship, were lashed fast in irons and betrayed to slavery. That great design over, they set all hands to work to hoist sail, and with as treacherous a fair a wind they made from the shore with this innocent and glorious prize, who thought of nothing less than such an entertainment. Some have commended this act as brave in the captain, but I will spare my sense of it, and leave it to my reader to judge as he pleases. It may be easily guessed in what manner the prince resented this indignity, who may be best resembled to a lion taken in a toil. So he raged, so he struggled for liberty, but all in vain. And they had so wisely managed his fetters that he could not use a hand in his defense to quit himself of a life that would by no means endure slavery, nor could he move from the place where he was tied to any solid part of the ship against which he might have beat his head and have finished his disgrace that way. So that being deprived of all other means, he resolved to perish for want of food, and pleased at last with that thought, and toiled and tired by rage and indignation, he laid himself down and sullenly resolved upon dying, and refused all things that were brought him. This did not a little vex the captain, and the more so because he found almost all of them of the same humour, so that the loss of so many brave slaves, so tall and goodly to behold, would have been very considerable. He therefore ordered one to go from him, for he would not be seen himself, to Oroonoko, and to assure him he was afflicted for having rashly done so unhospitable a deed, and which could not be now remedied, since they were far from shore. But since he resented it in so high a nature, he assured him he would revoke his resolution and set both him and his friends ashore on the next land they should touch at. And of this the messenger gave him his oath, provided he would resolve to live. And Oroonoko, whose honour was such as he never had violated a word in his life himself, much less a solemn asseveration, believed in an instant what this man said, but replied he expected for a confirmation of this, to have his shameful fetters dismissed. This demand was carried to the captain, who returned him answer that the offence had been so great which he had put upon the prince, that he durst not trust him with liberty while he remained in the ship, for fear lest by a valour natural to him, and a revenge that would animate that valour, he might commit some outrage fatal to himself and the king, his master, to whom this vessel did belong. To this, Oroonoko replied, he would engage his honour to behave himself in all friendly order and manner, and obey the command of the captain, as he was lord of the king's vessel, and general of those men under his command. This was delivered to the still doubting captain, who could not resolve to trust a heathen, he said upon his parole, a man that had no sense or notion of the God that he worshipped. Oroonoko then replied, he was very sorry to hear that the captain pretended to the knowledge and worship of any gods, who had taught him no better principles than not to credit as he would be credited. But they told him the difference of their faith occasioned that distrust, for the captain had protested to him upon the word of a Christian, and sworn in the name of a great God, which if he should violate, he would expect eternal torment in the world to come. Is that all the obligation he has to be just to his oath? Replied Oroonoko. Let him know, I swear by my honour, which to violate would not only render me contemptible and despised by all brave and honest men, and so give myself perpetual pain, but it would be eternally offending and displeasing all mankind, harming, betraying, circumventing and outraging all men, but punishments hereafter are suffered by oneself, and the world takes no cognizance whether this God have revenged him or not. 'Tis done so secretly and deferred so long, while the man of no honour suffers every moment the scorn and contempt of the honester world, and dies every day ignominiously in his fame, which is more valuable than life. I speak not this to move belief, but to show you how you mistake when you imagine that he who will violate his honour will keep his word with his gods. So turning from him with a disdainful smile, he refused to answer him when he urged him to know what answer he should carry back to his captain, so that he departed without saying any more. The captain, pondering and consulting what to do, it was concluded that nothing but Oroonoko's liberty would encourage any of the rest to eat, except the Frenchman, whom the captain could not pretend to keep prisoner, but only told him he was secured because he might act something in favour of the prince, but that he should be freed as soon as they came to land. So that they concluded it wholly necessary to free the prince from his irons, that he might show himself to the rest, that they might have an eye upon him, and that they could not fear a single man. This being resolved, to make the obligation the greater, the captain himself went to Oroonoko, where after many compliments and assurances of what he had already promised, he receiving from the prince his parole and his hand for his good behaviour, dismissed his irons and brought him to his own cabin, where after having treated and reposed him a while, for he had neither eat nor slept in 4 days before, he besought him to visit those obstinate people in chains, who refused all manner of sustenance, and entreated him to oblige him to eat, and assure him of that liberty on the first opportunity. Oroonoko, who was too generous not to give credit to his words, showed himself to his people, who were transported with excess of joy at the sight of their darling prince, falling at his feet and kissing and embracing him, believing as some divine oracle all he assured them. But he besought them to bear their chains with that bravery that became those whom he had seen act so nobly in arms, and that they could not give him greater proofs of their love and friendship, since 'twas all the security the captain, his friend, could have, against the revenge he said they might possibly justly take for the injury sustained by him. And they all with one accord assured him they could not suffer enough when it was for his repose and safety. After this, they no longer refused to eat, but took what was brought them and were pleased with their captivity, since by it they hoped to redeem the prince, who all the rest of the voyage was treated with all the respect due to his birth, though nothing could divert his melancholy, and he would often sigh for Emoinda, and think this as a punishment due to his misfortune in having left that noble maid behind him, that fatal night in the Otan, when he fled to the camp. Possessed with 1,000 thoughts of past joys with this fair young person, and 1,000 griefs for her eternal loss, he endured a tedious voyage, and at last arrived at the mouth of the river of Suriname, a colony belonging to the King of England, and where they were to deliver some part of their slaves. There, the merchants and gentlemen of the country going on board to demand those lots of slaves they had already agreed on, and amongst those, the overseers of those plantations where I then chanced to be, the captain, who had given the word, ordered his men to bring up those noble slaves in fetters, whom I have spoken of, and having put them some in one and some in other lots, with women and children, which they call pickaninnies, they sold them off as slaves to several merchants and gentlemen, not putting any two in one lot, because they would separate them far from each other, nor daring to trust them together, lest rage and courage should put them upon contriving some great action to the ruin of the colony. Oroonoko was first seized on and sold to our overseer, who had the first lot with 17 more of all sorts and sizes, but not one of quality with him. When he saw this, he found what they meant, for as I said, he understood English pretty well, and being wholly unarmed and defenseless, so as it was in vain to make any resistance, he only beheld the captain with a look all fierce and disdainful, upbraiding him with eyes that forced blushes on his guilty cheeks. He only cried in passing over the side of the ship, "Farewell, sir. 'Tis worth my sufferings to gain so true a knowledge both of you and of your gods by whom you swear." And desiring those that held him to forbear their pains, and telling them he would make no resistance, he cried, "Come, my fellow slaves, let us descend, and see if we can meet with more honor and honesty in the next world we shall touch upon." So he nimbly leaped into the boat, and showing no more concern, suffered himself to be rowed up the river with his 17 companions. The gentleman that bought him was a young Cornish gentleman, whose name was Treefry, a man of great wit and fine learning, and was carried into those parts by the Lord Governor to manage all his affairs. He, reflecting on the last words of Oroonoko to the captain, and beholding the richness of his vest, no sooner came into the boat but he fixed his eyes on him, and finding something so extraordinary in his face, his shape, and mien, a greatness of look and haughtiness in his air, and finding he spoke English, had a great mind to be inquiring into his quality and fortune, which, though Oroonoko endeavored to hide by only confessing he was above the rank of common slaves, Treefry soon found he was yet something greater than he confessed, and from that moment began to conceive so vast an esteem for him that he ever after loved him as his dearest brother, and showed him all the civilities due to so great a man. Treefry was a very good mathematician and a linguist, could speak French and Spanish, and in the 3 days they remained in the boat, for so long were they going from the ship to the plantation, he entertained Oroonoko so agreeably with his art and discourse that he was no less pleased with Treefry than he was with the prince, and he thought himself at least fortunate in this, that since he was a slave, as long as he would suffer himself to remain so, he had a man of so excellent wit and parts for a master. So that, before they had finished their voyage up the river, he made no scruple of declaring to Treefry all his fortunes, and most part of what I have here related, and put himself wholly into the hands of his new friend, whom he found resenting all the injuries were done him, and was charmed with all the greatness of his actions, which were recited with that modesty and delicate sense as wholly vanquished him and subdued him to his interest. And he promised him, on his word and honour, he would find the means to reconduct him to his own country again, assuring him he had a perfect abhorrence of so dishonourable an action, and that he would sooner have died than have been the author of such a perfidy. He found the prince was very much concerned to know what became of his friends, and how they took their slavery, and Treefry promised to take care about the inquiring after their condition, and that he should have an account of them, though, as Oroonoko afterwards said, he had little reason to credit the words of a Baccarat, yet he knew not why, but he saw a kind of sincerity, an awful truth in the face of Treefry. He saw an honesty in his eyes, and he found him wise and witty enough to understand honour, for it was one of his maxims. A man of wit could not be a knave or villain. In their passage up the river, they put in at several houses for refreshment, and ever when they landed, numbers of people would flock to behold this man. Not but their eyes were daily entertained with the sight of slaves, but the fame of Oroonoko was gone before him, and all people were in admiration of his beauty. Besides, he had a rich habit on, in which he was taken so different from the rest, and which the captain could not strip him of, because he was forced to surprise his person in the minute he sold him. When he found his habit made him liable, as he thought, to be gazed at the more, he begged Treefry to give him something more befitting a slave, which he did, and took off his robes. Nevertheless, he shone through all, and his Ossenbrigs, a sort of brown holland suit he had on, could not conceal the graces of his looks and mien, and he had no less admirers than when he had his dazzling habit on. The royal youth appeared in spite of the slave, and people could not help treating him after a different manner, without designing it. As soon as they approached him, they venerated and esteemed him. His eyes insensibly commanded respect, and his behaviour insinuated it into every soul, so that there was nothing talked of but this young and gallant slave, even by those who yet knew not that he was a prince. I ought to tell you that the Christians never buy any slaves, but they give them some name of their own, their native ones being likely very barbarous and hard to pronounce, so that Mr. Treefry gave Oroonoko that of Caesar, which name will live in that country as long as that scarce more glorious one of the great Roman. For 'tis most evident he wanted no part of the personal courage of that Caesar, and acted things as memorable had they been done in some part of the world replenished with people and historians that might have given him his due. But his misfortune was to fall in an obscure world that afforded only a female pen to celebrate his fame, though I doubt not but it had lived from others' endeavours if the Dutch, who immediately after his time took that country, had not killed, banished, and dispersed all those that were capable of giving the world this great man's life much better than I have done. And Mr. Treefry, who designed it, died before he began it, and bemoaned himself for not having undertook it in time. For the future, therefore, I must call Oroonoko Caesar, since by that name only he was known in our Western world, and by that name he was received on shore at Parham House, where he was destined a slave. But if the king himself, God bless him, had come ashore, there could not have been greater expectation by all the whole plantation and those neighboring ones than was on ours at that time. And he was received more like a governor than a slave, notwithstanding, as the custom was, they assigned him his portion of land, his house, and his business up in the plantation. But as it was more for form than any design to put him to his task, he endured no more of the slave, but the name, and remained some days in the house, receiving all visits that were made him, without stirring towards that part of the plantation where the negroes were. At last, he would needs go view his land, his house, and the business assigned him. But he no sooner came to the houses of the slaves, which are like a little town by itself, the negroes all having left work, but they all came forth to behold him, and found he was that prince who had, at several times, sold most of them to these parts. And from a veneration they pay to great men, especially if they know him, and from the surprise and awe they had at the sight of him, they all cast themselves at his feet, crying out in their language, "Live, O King! Long live, O King!" and kissing his feet, paid him even divine homage. Several English gentlemen were with him, and what Mr. Treefry had told him was here confirmed, of which he himself before had no other witness than Caesar himself. But he was infinitely glad to find his grandeur confirmed by the adoration of all the slaves. Caesar, troubled with their overjoy and over ceremony, besought him to rise and to receive him as their fellow slave, assuring them he was no better, at which they set up with one accord a most terrible and hideous mourning and condoling, which he and the English had much ado to appease. But at last they prevailed with them, and they prepared all their barbarous music, and everyone killed and dressed something of his own stock. For every family has their land apart, on which, at their leisure times, they breed all eatable things, and clubbing it together, made a most magnificent supper, inviting their grandee captain, their prince, to honour it with his presence, which he did, and several English with him, where they all waited on him, some playing, others dancing before him all the time, according to the manners of their several nations, and with unwearied industry endeavouring to please and delight him. While they sat at meat, Mr. Treefry told Caesar that most of these young slaves were undone in love with a fine she-slave, whom they had about 6 months on their land. The prince, who never heard the name of love without a sigh, nor any mention of it without the curiosity of examining further into that tale, which of all discourses was most agreeable to him, asked how they came to be so unhappy as to be all undone for one fair slave. Treefry, who was naturally amorous and loved to talk of love as well as anybody, proceeded to tell him they had the most charming black that ever was beheld on their plantation, about 15 or 16 years old, as he guessed, that for his part he had done nothing but sigh for her ever since she came, and that all the white beauties he had seen never charmed him so absolutely as this fine creature had done, and that no man of any nation ever beheld her that did not fall in love with her, and that she had all the slaves perpetually at her feet, and the whole country resounded with the fame of Clemaine. "For so," said he, "we have christened her, but she denies us all with such a noble disdain that 'tis a miracle to see that she, who can give such eternal desires, should herself be all ice and unconcerned." She is adorned with the most graceful modesty that ever beautified youth, the softest sire that if she were capable of love, one would swear she languished for some absent happy man, and so retired as if she feared a rape even from the god of day, or that the breezes would steal kisses from her delicate mouth. Her task of work, some scion lover every day makes it his petition to perform for her, which she accepts blushing and with reluctancy, for fear he will ask her a look for a recompense, which he dares not presume to hope. So great an awe she strikes into the hearts of her admirers. I do not wonder, replied the prince, that Clemene should refuse slaves, being, as you say, so beautiful, but wonder how she escapes those that can entertain her, as you can, or why, being your slave, you do not oblige her to yield. I confess, said Treefry, when I have, against her will, entertained her with love, so long as to be transported with my passion even above decency, I have been ready to make use of those advantages of strength and force nature has given me, but oh, she disarms me with that modesty and weeping so tender and so moving that I retire, and thank my stars she overcame me. The company laughed at his civility to a slave, and Caesar only applauded the nobleness of his passion and nature, since that slave might be noble, or what was better, have true notions of honor and virtue in her. Thus passed they this night, after having received from the slaves all imaginable respect and obedience. The next day, Treefry asked Caesar to walk when the heat was allayed, and designedly carried him by the cottage of the fair slave, and told him, she whom he spoke of last night lived there retired. But, says he, I would not wish you to approach, for I am sure you will be in love as soon as you behold her. Caesar assured him he was proof against all the charms of that sex, and that if he imagined his heart could be so perfidious to love again after Emoinda, he believed he should tear it from his bosom. They had no sooner spoke, but a little shock dog that Clemene had presented her, which she took great delight in, ran out, and she, not knowing anybody was there, ran to get it in again, and bolted out on those who were just speaking of her. When seeing them, she would have run in again, but Treefry caught her by the hand and cried, Clemene, however you fly a lover, you ought to pay some respect to this stranger, pointing to Caesar. But she, as if she had resolved never to raise her eyes to the face of a man again, bent him the more to the earth, when he spoke and gave the prince the leisure to look the more at her. There needed no long gazing or consideration to examine who this fair creature was. He soon saw Emoinda all over her. In a minute he saw her face, her shape, her air, her modesty, and all that carried forth his soul with joy at his eyes, and left his body destitute of almost life. It stood without motion, and for a minute knew not that it had a being, and I believe he had never come to himself, so oppressed he was with overjoy, if he had not met with this allay, that he perceived Emoinda fall dead in the hands of Treefry. This awakened him, and he ran to her aid, and caught her in his arms, where by degrees she came to herself. And 'tis needless to tell with what transports, what ecstasies of joy, they both a while beheld each other, without speaking, then snatched each other to their arms, then gazed again as if they still doubted whether they possessed the blessing they grasped. But when they recovered their speech, 'tis not to be imagined what tender things they expressed to each other, wondering what strange fate had brought them again together. They soon informed each other of their fortunes, and equally bewailed their fate. But at the same time they mutually protested that even fetters and slavery were soft and easy, and would be supported with joy and pleasure, while they could be so happy to possess each other, and be able to make good their vows. Caesar swore he disdained the empire of the world, while he could behold his Emoinda, and she despised grandeur and pomp, those vanities of her sex, when she could gaze on Oroonoko. He adored the very cottage where she resided, and said that little inch of the world would give him more happiness than all the universe could do. And she vowed it was a palace, while adorned with the presence of Oroonoko. Treefry was infinitely pleased with this novel, and found this Clemene was the fair mistress of whom Caesar had before spoke, and was not a little satisfied that heaven was so kind to the prince as to sweeten his misfortunes by so lucky an accident, and leaving the lovers to themselves, was impatient to come down to Parham House, which was on the same plantation, to give me an account of what had happened. I was as impatient to make these lovers a visit, having already made a friendship with Caesar, and from his own mouth learned what I have related, which was confirmed by his Frenchman, who was set on shore to seek his fortune, and of whom they could not make a slave because a Christian, and he came daily to Parham Hill to see and pay his respects to his pupil prince. So that concerning and interested myself in all that related to Caesar, whom I had assured of liberty as soon as the governor arrived, I hasted presently to the place where these lovers were, and was infinitely glad to find this beautiful young slave, who had already gained all our esteems for her modesty and her extraordinary prettiness, to be the same I had heard Caesar speak so much of. One may imagine then we paid her a treble respect, and though from her being carved in fine flowers and birds all over her body, we took her to be of quality before, yet when we knew Clemene was Emoinda, we could not enough admire her. I had forgot to tell you that those who are nobly born of that country are so delicately cut and raised all over the forepart of the trunk of their bodies, that it looks as if it were japanned, the works being raised like high point round the edges of the flowers. Some are only carved with a little flower or bird at the sides of the temples, as was Caesar, and those who are so carved over the body resemble our ancient pics that are figured in the chronicles, but these carvings are more delicate. From that happy day, Caesar took Clemene for his wife, to the general joy of all people, and there was as much magnificence as the country would afford at the celebration of this wedding, and in a very short time after, she conceived with child, which made Caesar even adore her, knowing he was the last of his great race. This new accident made him more impatient of liberty, and he was every day treating with Treefry for his and Clemene's liberty, and offered either gold or a vast quantity of slaves, which should be paid before they let him go, provided he could have any security that he should go when his ransom was paid. They fed him from day to day with promises, and delayed him till the Lord Governor should come, so that he began to suspect them of falsehood, and that they would delay him till the time of his wife's delivery, and make a slave of that too. For all the breed is theirs to whom the parents belong. This thought made him very uneasy, and his sullenness gave them some jealousies of him, so that I was obliged, by some persons who feared a mutiny, which is very fatal sometimes in those colonies that abound so with slaves, that they exceeded the whites in vast numbers, to discourse with Caesar and to give him all the satisfaction I possibly could. They knew he and Clemene were scarce an hour in a day from my lodgings, that they eat with me, and that I obliged them in all things I was capable of. I entertained them with the loves of the Romans, and great me, which charmed him to my company, and her, with teaching her all the pretty works that I was mistress of, and telling her stories of nuns, and endeavouring to bring her to the knowledge of the true God. But of all discourses, Caesar liked that the worst, and would never be reconciled to our notions of the Trinity, of which he ever made a jest. It was a riddle, he said, would turn his brain to conceive, and one could not make him understand what faith was. However, these conversations failed not altogether so well to divert him that he liked the company of us women much above the men, for he could not drink, and he is but an ill companion in that country that cannot. So that, obliging him to love us very well, we had all the liberty of speech with him, especially myself, whom he called his great mistress, and indeed my word would go a great way with him. For these reasons, I had opportunity to take notice to him that he was not well pleased of late, as he used to be, was more retired and thoughtful, and told him I took it ill he should suspect we would break our words with him, and not permit both him and Clemene to return to his own kingdom, which was not so long away, but when he was once on his voyage, he would quickly arrive there. He made me some answers that showed a doubt in him, which made me ask what advantage it would be to doubt. It would but give us a fear of him, and possibly compel us to treat him so as I should be very loath to behold. That is, it might occasion his confinement. Perhaps this was not so luckily spoke of me, for I perceived he resented that word, which I strove to soften again in vain. However, he assured me that whatsoever resolutions he should take, he would act nothing upon the white people, and as for myself and those upon that plantation where he was, he would sooner forfeit his eternal liberty and life itself than lift his hand against his greatest enemy on that place. He besought me to suffer no fears upon his account, for he could do nothing that honor should not dictate, but he accused himself for having suffered slavery so long. Yet he charged that weakness on love alone, who was capable of making him neglect even glory itself, and for which now he reproaches himself every moment of the day. Much more to this effect he spoke, with an air impatient enough to make me know he would not be long in bondage, and though he suffered only the name of a slave, and had nothing of the toil and labour of one, yet that was sufficient to render him uneasy, and he had been too long idle, who used to be always in action and in arms. He had a spirit all rough and fierce, and that could not be tamed to lazy rest, and though all endeavours were used to exercise himself in such actions and sports as this world afforded, as running, wrestling, pitching the bar, hunting and fishing, chasing and killing tigers of a monstrous size, which this continent affords in abundance, and wonderful snakes, such as Alexander is reported to have encountered at the river of Amazons, and which Caesar took great delight to overcome. Yet these were not actions great enough for his large soul, which was still panting after more renowned actions. Before I parted that day with him, I got with much ado a promise from him to rest yet a little longer with patience, and wait the coming of the Lord Governor, who was every day expected on our shore. He assured me he would, and this promise he desired me to know was given perfectly in complaisance to me, in whom he had an entire confidence. After this I neither thought it convenient to trust him much out of our view, nor did the country, who feared him, but with one accord it was advised to treat him fairly, and oblige him to remain with such a compass, and that he should be permitted as seldom as could be to go up to the plantations of the negroes, or if he did, to be accompanied by some that should be rather in appearance attendants than spies. This care was for some time taken, and Caesar looked upon it as a mark of extraordinary respect, and was glad his discontent had obliged him to be more observant to him. He received new assurance from the overseer, which was confirmed to him by the opinion of all the gentlemen of the country, who made their court to him. During this time that we had his company more frequently than hitherto we had had, it may not be unpleasant to relate to you the diversions we entertained him with, or rather, he, us. My stay was to be short in that country, because my father died at sea, and never arrived to possess the honour designed him, which was Lieutenant General of 36 islands, besides the continent of Suriname, nor the advantages he hoped to reap by them, so that though we were obliged to continue on our voyage, we did not intend to stay upon the place. Though in a word, I must say thus much of it, that certainly had his late Majesty, of sacred memory, but seen and known what a vast and charming world he had been master of in that continent, he would never have parted so easily with it to the Dutch. 'Tis a continent whose vast extent was never yet known, and may contain more noble earth than all the universe beside, for they say it reaches from east to west, one way as far as China, and another to Peru. It affords all things both for beauty and use. 'Tis their eternal spring, always the very months of April, May, and June. The shades are perpetual, the trees bearing at once all degrees of leaves and fruit, from blooming buds to ripe autumn, groves of oranges, lemons, citrons, figs, nutmegs, and noble aromatics continually bearing their fragrances. The trees appearing all like nosegays adorned with flowers of different kinds. Some are all white, some purple, some scarlet, some blue, some yellow, bearing at the same time ripe fruit, and blooming young, or producing every day new. The very wood of all these trees has an intrinsic value above common timber, for they are, when cut, of different colours, glorious to behold, and bear a price considerable to inlay withal. Besides this, they yield rich balm and gums, so that we make our candles of such an aromatic substance as does not only give a sufficient light, but as they burn, they cast their perfumes all about. Cedar is the common firing, and all the houses are built with it. The very meat we eat, when set on the table, if it be native, I mean of the country, perfumes the whole room, especially a little beast called an armadillo, a thing which I can liken to nothing so well as a rhinoceros. 'Tis all in white armour, so jointed that it moves as well in it as if it had nothing on. This beast is about the bigness of a pig of 6 weeks old, but it were endless to give an account of all the diverse, wonderful, and strange things that country affords, and which we took a very great delight to go in search of, though those adventures are oftentimes fatal, and at least dangerous. But while we had Caesar in our company on these designs, we feared no harm, nor suffered any. As soon as I came into the country, the best house in it was presented me, called St. John's Hill. It stood on a vast rock of white marble, at the foot of which the river ran a vast depth down, and not to be descended on that side, the little waves, still dashing and washing the foot of this rock, made the softest murmurs and purlins in the world. And the opposite bank was adorned with such vast quantities of different flowers eternally blowing, and every day an hour new, fenced behind them with lofty trees of 1,000 rare forms and colours, that the prospect was the most ravishing that sands can create. On the edge of this white rock, towards the river, was a walk or grove of orange and lemon trees, about half the length of the mall here. Flowery and fruit-bearing branches met at the top, and hindered the sun, whose rays are very fierce there, from entering a beam into the grove. and the cool air that came from the river made it not only fit to entertain people in, at all the hottest hours of the day, but refreshed the sweet blossoms and made it always sweet and charming. And sure, the whole globe of the world cannot show so delightful a place as this grove was. Not all the gardens of boasted Italy can produce a shade to outvie this, which nature had joined with art to render so exceeding fine. And 'tis a marvel to see how such vast trees as big as English oaks could take footing on so solid a rock, and in so little earth as covered that rock. But all things by nature there are rare, delightful, and wonderful, but to our sports. Sometimes we would go surprising and in search of young tigers in their dens, watching when the old ones went forth to forage for prey, and oftentimes we have been in great danger, and have fled apace for our lives when surprised by the dams. But once above all other times we went on this design, and Caesar was with us, who had no sooner stolen a young tiger from her nest, but going off, we encountered the dam, bearing a buttock of a cow, which she had torn off with her mighty paw, and going with it towards her den. We had only 4 women, Caesar, and an English gentleman, brother to Harry Martin, the great Oliverian. We found there was no escaping this enraged and ravenous beast. However, we women fled as fast as we could from it. But our heels had not saved our lives if Caesar had not laid down his club, when he found the tiger quit her prey to make more speed towards him, and taking Mr. Martin's sword, desired to stand aside or follow the ladies. He obeyed him, and Caesar met this monstrous beast of mighty size and vast limbs, who came with open jaws upon him, and fixing his awful stern eyes full upon those of the beast, and putting himself into a very steady and good aiming posture of defence, ran his sword quite through her breast, down to her very heart, home to the hilt of the sword. The dying beast stretched forth her paw, and going to grasp his thigh, surprised with death in that very moment, did him no other harm than fixing her long nails in his flesh very deep, feebly wounded him, but could not grasp the flesh to tear off any. When he had done this, he holloed to us to return, which after some assurance of his victory we did, and found him lunging out the sword from the bosom of the tiger, who was laid in her blood on the ground. He took up the club, and with an unconcern that had nothing of the joy or gladness of a victory, he came and laid the whelp at my feet. We all extremely wondered at his daring, and at the bigness of the beast, which was about the height of an heifer, but of mighty great and strong limbs. Another time, being in the woods, he killed a tiger which had long infested that part, and borne away abundance of sheep and oxen, and other things that were for the support of those to whom they belonged. Abundance of people assailed this beast, some affirming they had shot her with several bullets quite through the body at several times, and some swearing they shot her through the very heart, and they believed she was a devil rather than a mortal thing. Caesar had often said he had a mind to encounter this monster, and spoke with several gentlemen who had attempted her, one crying, "I shot her with so many poisoned arrows," another with his gun in this part of her, and another in that, so that he, remarking all these places where she was shot, fancied still he should overcome her by giving her another sort of a wound than any had yet done, and one day said at the table, "What trophies and garlands, ladies, will you make me if I bring you home the heart of this ravenous beast that eats up all your lambs and pigs?" We all promised he should be rewarded at all our hands, so taking a bow, which he chose out of a great many, he went up into the wood with 2 gentlemen, where he imagined this devourer to be. They had not passed very far in it, but they heard her voice growling and grumbling, as if she were pleased with something she was doing. When they came in view, they found her muzzling in the belly of a new ravished sheep, which she had torn open, and seeing herself approached, she took fast hold of her prey with her forepaws, and set a very fierce, raging look on Caesar, without offering to approach him, for fear at the same time of losing what she had in possession. So that Caesar remained a good while, only taking aim and getting an opportunity to shoot her where he designed. 'Twas some time before he could accomplish it, and to wound her and not kill her would but have enraged her the more and endangered him. He had a quiver of arrows at his side, so that if one failed, he could be supplied. At last, retiring a little, he gave her opportunity to eat, for he found she was ravenous, and fell to as soon as she saw him retire, being more eager of her prey than of doing new mischiefs. When he going softly to one side of her, and hiding his person behind certain herbage that grew high and thick, he took so good aim that, as he intended, he shot her just into the eye, and the arrow was sent with so good a will and so sure a hand that it stuck in her brain and made her caper and become mad for a moment or two. But being seconded by another arrow, she fell dead upon the prey. Caesar cut her open with a knife to see where those wounds were that had been reported to him, and why she did not die of them. But I shall now relate a thing that possibly will find no credit among men, because 'tis a notion commonly received with us, that nothing can receive a wound in the heart and live. But when the heart of this courageous animal was taken out, there were 7 bullets of lead in it. The wound seamed up with great scars, and she lived with the bullets a great while, for it was long since they were shot. This heart the conqueror brought up to us, and 'twas a very great curiosity which all the country came to see, and which gave Caesar occasion of many fine discourses of accidents in war and strange escapes. At other times he would go a-fishing, and discoursing on that diversion, he found we had in that country a very strange fish, called a numb eel, an eel of which I have eaten, that while it is alive, it has a quality so cold that those who are angling, though with a line of ever so great a length, with a rod at the end of it, it shall in the same minute the bait is touched by this eel, seize him or her that holds the rod with a numbness that shall deprive him of sense for a while. And some have fallen into the water, and others dropped as dead on the banks of the river where they stood, as soon as this fish touches the bait. Caesar used to laugh at this, and believed it impossible a man could lose his force at the touch of a fish, and could not understand that philosophy, that a cold quality should be of that nature. However, he had a great curiosity to try whether it would have the same effect on him it had on others, and often tried, but in vain. At last, the sought-for fish came to the bait, as he stood angling on the bank, and instead of throwing away the rod or giving it a sudden twitch out of the water, whereby he might have caught both the eel and have dismissed the rod before it could have too much power over him for experiment's sake, he grasped it but the harder, and fainting, fell into the river, and being still possessed of the rod, the tide carried him, senseless as he was, a great way, till an Indian boat took him up, and perceived, when they touched him, a numbness seized them, and by that knew the rod was in his hand, which with a paddle, that is, a short oar, they struck away, and snatched it into the boat, eel and all. If Caesar was almost dead with the effect of this fish, he was more so with that of the water, where he had remained the space of going a league, and they found they had much ado to bring him back to life. But at last they did, and brought him home, where he was in a few hours well recovered and refreshed, and not a little ashamed to find he should be overcome by an eel, and that all the people who heard his defiance would laugh at him. But we cheered him up, and he being convinced we had the eel at supper, which was a quarter of an ell about, and most delicate meat, and was of the more value, since it cost so dear as almost the life of so gallant a man. About this time, we were in many mortal fears about some disputes the English had with the Indians, so that we could scarce trust ourselves without great numbers to go to any Indian towns or place where they abode, for fear they should fall upon us, as they did immediately after my coming away, and the place being in the possession of the Dutch. They used them not so civilly as the English, so they cut in pieces all they could take, getting into houses and hanging up the mother and all her children about her, and cut a footman I left behind me, all in joints, and nailed him to trees. This feud began while I was there, so that I lost half the satisfaction I proposed in not seeing and visiting the Indian towns. But one day, bemoaning of our misfortunes upon this account, Caesar told us we need not fear, for if we had a mind to go, he would undertake to be our guard. Some would, but most would not venture. About 18 of us resolved, and took barge, and after 8 days arrived near an Indian town. But approaching it, the hearts of some of our company failed, and they would not venture on shore. So we polled, who would and who would not. For my part, I said, if Caesar would, I would go. He resolved, so did my brother and my woman, a maid of good courage. Now, none of us speaking the language of the people, and imagining we should have a half diversion in gazing only, and not knowing what they said, we took a fisherman that lived at the mouth of the river, who had been a long inhabitant there, and obliged him to go with us. But because he was known to the Indians as trading among them, and being by long living there become a perfect Indian in colour, we, who had a mind to surprise them by making them see something they never had seen, that is, white people, resolved only myself, my brother, and woman should go. So Caesar, the fisherman, and the rest, hiding behind some thick reeds and flowers that grew in the banks, let us pass on towards the town, which was on the bank of the river all along. A little distance from the houses or huts, we saw some dancing, others busied in fetching and carrying of water from the river. They had no sooner spied us, but they set up a loud cry that frightened us at first. We thought it had been for those that should kill us, but it seems it was of wonder and amazement. They were all naked, and we were dressed, so as is most commode for the hot countries, very glittering and rich, so that we appeared extremely fine. My own hair was cut short, and I had a taffety cap with black feathers on my head. My brother was in a stuff suit with silver loops and buttons, and abundance of green ribbon. This was all infinitely surprising to them, and because we saw them stand still till we approached them, we took heart and advanced, came up to them and offered them our hands, which they took and looked on us round about, calling still for more company, who came swarming out, all wondering, and crying out, "Teepee me," taking their hair up in their hands and spreading it wide to those they called out to, as if they would say, as indeed it signified, numberless wonders, or not to be recounted, no more than to number the hair of their heads. By degrees they grew more bold, and from gazing upon us round, they touched us, laying their hands upon all the features of our faces, feeling our breasts and arms, taking up one petticoat, then wondering to see another, admiring our shoes and stockings, but more our garters, which we gave them, and they tied about their legs, being laced with silver lace at the ends, for they much esteem any shining things. In fine, we suffered them to survey us as they pleased, and we thought they would never have done admiring us. When Caesar and the rest saw we were received with such wonder, they came up to us, and finding the Indian trader, whom they knew, for 'tis by these fishermen called Indian traders, we hold a commerce with them, for they love not to go far from home, and we never go to them. When they saw him, therefore, they set up a new joy, and cried in their language, "Oh, here's our Tigwami, and we shall now know whether those things can speak." So, advancing to him, some of them gave him their hands and cried, "Amora Tigwami," which is as much as, "How do you do?" or "Welcome, friend." And all with one din began to gabble to him, and asked if we had sense and wit, if we could talk of affairs of life and war, as they could, if we could hunt, swim, and do 1,000 things they use. He answered them we could. Then they invited us into their houses, and dressed venison and buffalo for us, and going out, gathered a leaf of a tree called a sarumbo leaf of 6 yards long, and spread it on the ground for a tablecloth, and cutting another in pieces, instead of plates, set us on low Indian stools, which they cut out of one entire piece of wood, and paint in a sort of Japan work. They serve everyone their mess on these pieces of leaves, and it was very good, but too high seasoned with pepper. When we had eat, my brother and I took out our flutes, and played to 'em, which gave 'em new wonder, and I soon perceived by an admiration that is natural to these people, and by the extreme ignorance and simplicity of 'em, it were not difficult to establish any unknown or extravagant religion among them, and to impose any notions or fictions upon 'em. For seeing a kinsman of mine set some paper on fire with a burning glass, a trick they had never before seen, they were like to have adored him for a god, and begged he would give 'em the characters or figures of his name, that they might oppose it against winds and storms, which he did, and they held it up in those seasons, and fancied it had a charm to conquer them, and kept it like a holy relic. They are very superstitious, and called him the great P, that is, prophet. They showed us their Indian P, a youth of about 16 years old, as handsome as nature could make a man. They consecrate a beautiful youth from his infancy, and all arts are used to complete him in the finest manner, both in beauty and shape. He is bred to all the little arts and cunning they are capable of, to all the legerdemain tricks and sleight of hand, whereby he imposes upon the rabble, and is both a doctor in physic and divinity, and by these tricks makes the sick believe he sometimes eases their pains, by drawing from the afflicted part little serpents, or odd flies, or worms, or any strange thing. And though they have besides undoubted good remedies for almost all their diseases, they cure the patient more by fancy than by medicines, and make themselves feared, loved, and reverenced. This young P had a very young wife, who, seeing my brother kiss her, came running and kissed me. After this they kissed one another, and made it a very great jest, it being so novel, and new admiration and laughing went round the multitude, that they will never forget that ceremony, never before used or known. Caesar had a mind to see and talk with their war captains, and we were conducted to one of their houses, where we beheld several of the great captains, who had been at council, but so frightful a vision it was to see 'em no fancy can create. No sad dreams can represent so dreadful a spectacle. For my part, I took 'em for hobgoblins, or fiends rather than men. But however their shapes appeared, their souls were very humane and noble. But some wanted their noses, some their lips, some both noses and lips, some their ears, and others cut through each cheek with long slashes, through which their teeth appeared. They had several other formidable wounds and scars, or rather dismemberings. They had comiteas, or little aprons before 'em, and girdles of cotton, with their knives naked stuck in it, a bow at their back, and a quiver of arrows on their thighs, and most had feathers on their heads of divers colours. They cried Amora Tiguame to us at our entrance, and were pleased we said as much to them. They seated us, and gave us drink of the best sort, and wondered as much as the others had done before to see us. Caesar was marvelling as much at their faces, wondering how they should all be so wounded in war. He was impatient to know how they all came by those frightful marks of rage or malice, rather than wounds got in noble battle. They told us by our interpreter that when any war was waging, 2 men, chosen out by some old captain whose fighting was past, and who could only teach the theory of war, were to stand in competition for the generalship or great war captain, and being brought before the old judges now past war, they are asked what they dare do to show they are worthy to lead an army. When he who is first asked, making no reply, cuts off his nose and throws it contemptibly on the ground, and the other does something to himself that he thinks surpasses him, and perhaps deprives himself of lips and an eye, so they slash on till one gives out, and many have died in this debate. And it's by a passive valor they show and prove their activity, a sort of courage too brutal to be applauded by our black hero. Nevertheless, he expressed his esteem of them. In this voyage, Caesar begat so good an understanding between the Indians and the English that there were no more fears or heartburnings during our stay, but we had a perfect, open, and free trade with them. Many things remarkable and worthy reciting we met within this short voyage, because Caesar made it his business to search out and provide for our entertainment, especially to please his dearly adored Emoinda, who was a sharer in all our adventures, we being resolved to make her chains as easy as we could, and to compliment the prince in that manner that most obliged him. As we were coming up again, we met with some Indians of strange aspects, that is, of a larger size, and other sort of features than those of our country. Our Indian slaves that rowed us asked them some questions, but they could not understand us, but showed us a long cotton string with several knots on it, and told us they had been coming from the mountains so many moons as there were knots. They were habited in skins of a strange beast, and brought along with them bags of gold dust, which, as well as they could give us to understand, came streaming in little small channels down the high mountains when the rains fell, and offered to be the convoy to anybody or persons that would go to the mountains. We carried these men up to Parham, where they were kept till the Lord Governor came, and because all the country was made to be going on this golden adventure, the governor, by letters, commanded, for they sent some of the gold to him, that a guard be set at the mouth of the river of Amazons, a river so called, almost as broad as the river of Thames, and prohibited all people from going up that river, it conducting to those mountains of gold. But we going off for England before the project was further prosecuted, and the governor, being drowned in a hurricane, either the design died, or the Dutch have the advantage of it, and 'tis to be bemoaned what his majesty lost by losing that part of America. Though this digression is a little from my story, however, since it contains some proofs of the curiosity and daring of this great man, I was content to omit nothing of his character. It was thus for some time we diverted him, but now Emoinda began to show she was with child, and did nothing but sigh and weep for the captivity of her lord, herself, and the infant, yet unborn, and believed if it were so hard to gain the liberty of 2, 'twould be more difficult to get that for 3. Her griefs were so many darts in the great heart of Caesar, and taking his opportunity one Sunday, when all the whites were overtaken in drink, as there were abundance of several trades and slaves for 4 years that inhabited among the negro houses, and Sunday being their day of debauch, otherwise they were a sort of spies upon Caesar, he went, pretending out of goodness to him, to feast among them, and sent all his music, and ordered a great treat for the whole gang, about 300 negroes, and about 150 were able to bear arms, such as they had, which were sufficient to do execution with spirits accordingly. For the English had none but rusty swords, that no strength could draw from a scabbard, except the people of particular quality, who took care to oil them and keep them in good order. The guns also, unless here and there one, or those newly carried from England, would do no good or harm, for 'tis the nature of that country to rust and eat up iron, or any metals but gold and silver, and they are very unexpert at the bow, which the negroes and the Indians are perfect masters of. Caesar, having singled out these men from the women and children, made an harangue to them of the miseries and ignominies of slavery, counting up all their toils and sufferings, under such loads, burdens, and drudgeries as were fitter for beasts than men, senseless brutes than human souls. He told them it was not for days, months, or years, but for eternity. There was no end to be of their misfortunes, They suffered not like men, who might find a glory and fortitude in oppression, but like dogs, that loved the whip and bell, and fawned the more they were beaten, that they had lost the divine quality of men and were become insensible asses, fit only to bear, nay, worse, an ass or dog or horse, having done his duty, could lie down in retreat and rise to work again, and while he did his duty, endured no stripes, but men, villainous, senseless men such as they, toiled on all the tedious week till Black Friday, and then whether they worked or not, whether they were faulty or meriting, they promiscuously, the innocent with the guilty, suffered the infamous whip, the sordid stripes from their fellow slaves, till their blood trickled from all parts of their body, blood whose every drop ought to be revenged with the life of some of those tyrants that impose it. And why, said he, my dear friends and fellow sufferers, should we be slaves to an unknown people? Have they vanquished us nobly in fight? Have they won us in honorable battle? And are we by the chance of war become their slaves? This would not anger a noble heart. This would not animate a soldier's soul. No, but we are bought and sold like apes or monkeys, to be the sport of women, fools and cowards, and the support of rogues and runagates that have abandoned their own countries for rapine, murders, theft and villainies. Do you not hear every day how they upbraid each other with infamy of life, below the wildest savages? And shall we render obedience to such a degenerate race, who have no one human virtue left to distinguish them from the vilest creatures? Will you, I say, suffer the lash from such hands? They all replied with one accord, No, no, no. Caesar has spoken like a great captain, like a great king. After this, he would have proceeded, but was interrupted by a tall Negro of some more quality than the rest. His name was Tuscan, who, bowing at the feet of Caesar, cried, My lord, we have listened with joy and attention to what you have said. And were we only men, would follow so great a leader through the world. But oh, consider we are husbands and parents too, and have things more dear to us than life, our wives and children, unfit for travel in those unpassable woods, mountains and bogs. We have not only difficult lands to overcome, but rivers to wade, and mountains to encounter, ravenous beasts of prey. To this, Caesar replied that honor was the first principle in nature, that was to be obeyed, but as no man would pretend to that without all the acts of virtue, compassion, charity, love, justice, and reason, he found it not inconsistent with that to take equal care of their wives and children as they would of themselves, and that he did not design, when he led them to freedom and glorious liberty, that they should leave that better part of themselves to perish by the hand of the tyrant's whip. But if there were a woman among them so degenerate from love and virtue, to choose slavery before the pursuit of her husband, and with the hazard of her life to share with him in his fortunes, that such a one ought to be abandoned and left as a prey to the common enemy. To which they all agreed and bowed. After this he spoke of the impassable woods and rivers, and convinced them the more danger, the more glory. He told them that he had heard of one Hannibal, a great captain, had cut his way through mountains of solid rocks, and should a few shrubs oppose them, which they could fire before him? No, 'twas a trifling excuse to men resolved to die or overcome. As for bogs, they are with a little labour filled and hardened, and the rivers could be no obstacle, since they swam by nature, at least by custom, from the first hour of their birth, that when the children were weary they must carry them by turns, and the woods and their own industry would afford them food. To this they all assented with joy. Tuscan then demanded what he would do. He said they would travel towards the sea, plant a new colony, and defend it by their valor. And when they could find a ship, either driven by stress of weather or guided by providence that way, they would seize it and make it a prize, till it had transported them to their own countries, At least they should be made free in his kingdom, and be esteemed as his fellow sufferers, and men that had the courage and the bravery to attempt at least for liberty. And if they died in the attempt, it would be more brave than to live in perpetual slavery. They bowed and kissed his feet at this resolution, and with one accord vowed to follow him to death. And that night was appointed to begin their march. They made it known to their wives, and directed them to tie their hammock about their shoulders, and under their arm like a scarf, and to lead their children that could go, and carry those that could not. The wives, who pay an entire obedience to their husbands, obeyed, and stayed for them where they were appointed. The men stayed but to furnish themselves with what defensive arms they could get. And all met at the rendezvous, where Caesar made a new encouraging speech to him, and led him out. But as they could not march far that night, on Monday early, when the overseers went to call them all together to go to work, they were extremely surprised to find not one upon the place, but all fled with what baggage they had. You may imagine this news was not only suddenly spread all over the plantation, but soon reached the neighboring ones, and we had by noon about 600 men, they call the militia of the country, that came to assist us in the pursuit of the fugitives. But never did one see so comical an army march forth to war. The men of any fashion would not concern themselves, though it were almost the common cause for such revoltings, are very ill examples, and have very fatal consequences oftentimes, in many colonies. But they had respect for Caesar, and all hands were against the Pahamites, as they called those of Paham plantation, because they did not in the first place love the Lord Governor, and secondly, they would have it that Caesar was ill-used and baffled with, and 'tis not impossible, but some of the best in the country was of his counsel in this flight, and depriving us of all the slaves, so that they of the better sort would not meddle in the matter. The deputy governor, of whom I have had no great occasion to speak, and who was the most fawning, fair-tongued fellow in the world, and one that pretended the most friendship to Caesar, was now the only violent man against him. And though he had nothing, and so need fear nothing, yet talked and looked bigger than any man. He was a fellow whose character is not fit to be mentioned with the worst of the slaves. This fellow would lead his army forth to meet Caesar, or rather to pursue him. Most of their arms were of those sort of cruel whips they call cat with nine tails. Some had rusty, useless guns for show, others old basket hilts, whose blades had never seen the light in this age, and others had long staffs and clubs. Mr. Treefry went along rather to be a mediator than a conqueror in such a battle, for he foresaw and knew if by fighting they put the Negroes into despair, they were a sort of sullen fellows that would drown or kill themselves before they would yield, and he advised that fair means was best. But Byam was one that abounded his own wit, and would take his own measures. It was not hard to find these fugitives, for as they fled, they were forced to fire and cut the woods before them, so that night or day they pursued them by the light they made, and by the path they had cleared. But as soon as Caesar found he was pursued, he put himself in a posture of defense, placing all the women and children in the rear, and himself with Tuscan by his side, or next to him, all promising to die or conquer. Encouraged thus, they never stood to parley, but fell on pell-mell upon the English, and killed some and wounded a great many, they having recourse to their whips as the best of their weapons. And as they observed no order, they perplexed the enemy so sorely, with lashing them in the eyes, and the women and children seeing their husbands so treated, being of fearful cowardly dispositions, and hearing the English cry out, "Yield and live! Yield and be pardoned!" they all run in amongst their husbands and fathers, and hung about them, crying out, "Yield, and leave Caesar to their revenge!" That by degrees the slaves abandoned Caesar, and left him only Tuscan and his heroic Emoinda, who, grown big as she was, did nevertheless press near her lord, having a bow and a quiver full of poisoned arrows, which she managed with such dexterity that she wounded several, and shot the governor into the shoulder, of which wound he had like to have died, but that an Indian woman, his mistress, sucked the wound, and cleansed it from the venom. But however, he stirred not from the place till he had parleyed with Caesar, who he found was resolved to die fighting, and would not be taken, no more would Tuscan or Emoinda. But he, more thirsting after revenge of another sort than that of depriving him of life, now made use of all his art of talking and dissembling, and besought Caesar to yield himself upon terms which he himself should propose, and should be scarcely assented to, and kept by him. He told him it was not that he any longer feared him, or could believe the force of 2 men and a young heroine could overthrow all them, and with all the slaves now on their side also. But it was the vast esteem he had for his person, the desire he had to serve so gallant a man, and to hinder himself from the reproach hereafter of having been the occasion of the death of a prince, whose valour and magnanimity deserved the empire of the world. He protested to him he looked upon this action as gallant and brave, however tending to the prejudice of his lord and master, who would by it have lost so considerable a number of slaves, that this flight of his should be looked on as a heat of youth and a rashness of a too forward courage, and an unconsidered impatience of liberty, and no more, and that he laboured in vain to accomplish that which they would effectually perform as soon as any ship arrived that would touch on his coast. So that if you will be pleased, continued he, to surrender yourself, all imaginable respect shall be paid you, and yourself, your wife and child, if it be born here, shall depart free out of our land. But Caesar would hear of no composition, though Behn urged if he pursued and went on in his design, he would inevitably perish, either by great snakes, wild beasts, or hunger. And he ought to have regard to his wife, whose condition required ease, and not the fatigues of tedious travel, where she could not be secured from being devoured. But Caesar told him there was no faith in the white men, or the gods they adored, who instructed them in principles so false that honest men could not live amongst them, though no people professed so much, none performed so little that he knew what he had to do when he dealt with men of honour. But with them a man ought to be eternally on his guard, and never to eat and drink with Christians without his weapon of defence in his hand, and for his own security never to credit one word they spoke. As for the rashness and inconsiderateness of his action, he would confess the governor is in the right, and that he was ashamed of what he had done in endeavouring to make those free who were by nature slaves, poor wretched rogues, fit to be used as Christians' tolls, dogs, treacherous and cowardly, fit for such masters, and they wanted only but to be whipped into the knowledge of the Christian gods, to be the vilest of all creeping things, to learn to worship such deities as had not power to make them just, brave, or honest. In fine, after 1,000 things of this nature, not fit here to be recited, he told Behn he had rather die than live upon the same earth with such dogs. But Treefry and Behn pleaded and protested together so much that Treefry, believing the governor to mean what he said, and speaking very cordially himself, generously put himself into Caesar's hands, and took him aside, and persuaded him, were with tears, to live by surrendering himself and to name his conditions. Caesar was overcome by his wit and reasons, and in consideration of Emoinda, and demanding what he desired, and that it should be ratified by their hands in writing, because he had perceived that was the common way of contract between man and man amongst the whites. All this was performed, and Tuscan's pardon was put in, and they surrendered to the governor, who walked peaceably down into the plantation with them, after giving order to bury their dead. Caesar was very much toiled with the bustle of the day, for he had fought like a fury, and what mischief was done, he and Tuscan performed alone, and gave their enemies a fatal proof that they durst do anything, and feared no mortal force. But they were no sooner arrived at the place where all the slaves received their punishments of whipping, but they laid hands on Caesar and Tuscan, faint with heat and toil, and surprising them, bound them to 2 several stakes, and whipped them in a most deplorable and inhuman manner, rending the very flesh from their bones, especially Caesar, who was not perceived to make any moan or to alter his face, only to roll his eyes on the faithless governor and those he believed guilty with fierceness and indignation. And to complete his rage, he saw every one of those slaves, who but a few days before adored him as something more than mortal, now had a whip to give him some lashes, while he strove not to break his fetters, though if he had, it were impossible. But he pronounced a woe and revenge from his eyes that darted fire, which was at once both awful and terrible to behold. When they thought they were sufficiently revenged on him, they untied him, almost fainting with loss of blood from 1,000 wounds all over his body, from which they had rent his clothes, and led him bleeding and naked as he was, and loaded him all over with irons, and then rubbed his wounds, to complete their cruelty, with Indian pepper, which had like to have made him raving mad, and in this condition made him so fast to the ground that he could not stir if his pains and wounds would have given him leave. They spared Emoinda, and did not let her see this barbarity committed towards her lord, but carried her down to Parum and shut her up, which was not in kindness to her, but for fear she should die with the sight, or miscarry, and then they should lose a young slave and perhaps the mother. You must know that when the news was brought on Monday morning that Caesar had betaken himself to the woods, and carried with him all the negroes, we were possessed with extreme fear, which no persuasions could dissipate, that he would secure himself till night, and then that he would come down and cut all our throats. This apprehension made all the females of us fly down the river to be secured, and while we were away they acted this cruelty, for I suppose I had authority and interest enough there, had I suspected any such thing, to have prevented it. But we had not gone many leagues but the news overtook us that Caesar was taken and whipped like a common slave. We met on the river with Colonel Martin, a man of great gallantry, wit, and goodness, and whom I have celebrated in a character of my new comedy, by his own name in memory of so brave a man. He was wise and eloquent, and from the fineness of his parts bore a great sway over the hearts of all the colony. He was a friend to Caesar, and resented this false dealing with him very much. We carried him back to Parum, thinking to have made an accommodation, when he came. The first news we heard was that the governor was dead of a wound Emoinda had given him. But it was not so well. But it seems he would have the pleasure of beholding the revenge he took on Caesar. And before the cruel ceremony was finished, he dropped down, and then they perceived the wound he had on his shoulder was by a venomed arrow, which, as I said, his Indian mistress healed by sucking the wound. We were no sooner arrived, but we went up to the plantation to see Caesar, whom we found in a very miserable and unexpressible condition, and I have 1,000 times admired how he lived in so much tormenting pain. We said all things to him that trouble, pity, and good nature could suggest, protesting our innocency of the fact and our abhorrence of such cruelties, making 1,000 professions and services to him, and begging as many pardons for the offenders, till we said so much that he believed we had no hand in his ill treatment, but told us he could never pardon Behn. As for Treefry, he confessed he saw his grief and sorrow for his suffering, which he could not hinder, but was like to have been beaten down by the very slaves, for speaking in his defense. But for Behn, who was their leader, their head, and should by his justice and honor have been an example to him, for him he wished to live to take a dire revenge of him, and said, it had been well for him if he had sacrificed me instead of giving me the contemptible whip. He refused to talk much, but begging us to give him our hands, he took them, and protested never to lift up his to do us any harm. He had a great respect for Colonel Martin, and always took his counsel like that of a parent, and assured him he would obey him in anything but his revenge on Behn. Therefore, said he, for his own safety let him speedily dispatch me, For if I could dispatch myself, I would not till that justice were done to my injured person and the contempt of a soldier. No, I would not kill myself even after a whipping, but will be content to live with that infamy and be pointed at by every grinning slave till I have completed my revenge. And then you shall see that Oroonoko scorns to live with the indignity that was put on Caesar. All we could do could get no more words from him, and we took care to have him put immediately into a healing bath, to rid him of his pepper, and ordered a chirurgeon to anoint him with healing balm, which he suffered, and in some time he began to be able to walk and eat. We failed not to visit him every day, and to that end had him brought to an apartment at Parham. The governor had no sooner recovered and had heard of the menaces of Caesar, but he called his council, who, not to disgrace them or burlesque the government there, consisted of such notorious villains as Newgate never transported, and possibly originally were such who understood neither the laws of God or man, and had no sort of principles to make them worthy the name of men, but at the very council table would contradict and fight with one another, and swear so bloodily that 'twas terrible to hear and see 'em. Some of them were afterwards hanged when the Dutch took possession of the place, others sent off in chains. But calling these special rulers of the nation together, and requiring their counsel in this weighty affair, they all concluded that, damn 'em, it might be their own cases, and that Caesar ought to be made an example to all the Negroes, to fright 'em from daring to threaten their betters, their lords and masters. And at this rate no man was safe from his own slaves, and concluded, nemine contradicente, that Caesar should be hanged. Treefry then thought it time to use his authority, and told Behn his command did not extend to his lord's plantation, and that Parham was as much exempt from the law as Whitehall, and that they ought no more to touch the servants of the Lord, who there represented the king's person, than they could those about the king himself, and that Parham was a sanctuary, and though his lord were absent in person, his power was still in being there, which he had entrusted with him, as far as the dominions of his particular plantations reached, and all that belonged to it, the rest of the country, as Behn was lieutenant to his lord, he might exercise his tyranny upon. Treefry had others as powerful or more that interested themselves in Caesar's life, and absolutely, said he, should be defended. So turning the governor and his wise council out of doors, for they sat at Parham House, we set a guard upon our lodging place, and would admit none but those we called friends to us and Caesar. The governor, having remained wounded at Parham till his recovery was completed, Caesar did not know, but he was still there, and indeed, for the most part, his time was spent there. For he was one that loved to live at other people's expense, and if he were a day absent, he was 10 present there, and used to play and walk and hunt and fish with Caesar, so that Caesar did not at all doubt if he once recovered strength, but he should find an opportunity of being revenged on him, though after such a revenge he could not hope to live, for if he escaped the fury of the English mobile, who perhaps would have been glad of the occasion to have killed him, he was resolved not to survive his whipping. Yet he had some tender hours, a repenting softness, which he called his fits of cowardice, wherein he struggled with love for the victory of his heart, which took part with his charming Emoinda there. But for the most part his time was passed in melancholy thoughts and black designs. He considered if he should do this deed and die either in the attempt or after it, he left his lovely Emoinda a prey, or at best a slave to the enraged multitude. His great heart could not endure that thought. Perhaps, said he, she may be first ravished by every brute, exposed first to their nasty lusts, and then a shameful death. No, he could not live a moment under that apprehension, too insupportable to be borne. These were his thoughts and his silent arguments with his heart, as he told us afterwards. So that now resolving not only to kill Behn, but all those he thought had enraged him, pleasing his great heart with the fancied slaughter he should make over the whole face of the plantation, he first resolved on a deed that, however horrid it first appeared to us all, When we heard his reasons, we thought it brave and just. Being able to walk, and as he believed, fit for the execution of his great design, he begged Treefry to truss him into the air, believing a walk would do him good, which was granted him, and taking Emoinda with him, as he used to do in his more happy and calmer days, he led her up into a wood, where after with 1,000 sighs, and long gazing silently on her face, while tears gushed in spite of him from his eyes, he told her his design, first of killing her, and then his enemies, and next himself, and the impossibility of escaping, and therefore he told her the necessity of dying. He found the heroic wife faster pleading for death that he was to propose it, when she found his fixed resolution, and on her knees besought him not to leave her a prey to his enemies. He, grieved to death yet pleased at her noble resolution, took her up, and embracing of her with all the passion and languishment of a dying lover, drew his knife to kill this treasure of his soul, this pleasure of his eyes, while tears trickled down his cheeks. Hers was smiling with joy. She should die by so noble a hand, and be sent into her own country, for that's their notion of the next world, by him she so tenderly loved, and so truly adored in this. For wives have a respect for their husbands equal to what any other people pay a deity, and when a man finds any occasion to quit his wife, if he love her, she dies by his hand. If not, he sells her, or suffers some other to kill her. It being thus, you may believe the deed was soon resolved on, and 'tis not to be doubted but the parting, the eternal leave-taking of two such lovers, so greatly born, so sensible, so beautiful, so young and so fond, must be very moving, as the relation of it was to be afterwards. All that love could say in such cases being ended, and all the intermittent irresolutions being adjusted, the lovely young and adored victim lays herself down before the sacrificer, while he, with a hand resolved and a heart breaking within, gave the fatal stroke, first cutting her throat, and then severing her yet smiling face from that delicate body, pregnant as it was with the fruits of tenderest love. As soon as he had done, he laid the body decently on leaves and flowers, of which he made a bed, and concealed it under the same coverlid of nature. Only her face he left yet bare to look on, but when he found she was dead and past all treachery, never more to bless him with her eyes and soft language, his grief swelled up to rage. He tore, he raved, he roared like some monster of the wood, calling on the loved name of Emoinda. 1,000 times he turned the fatal knife that did the deed toward his own heart, with a resolution to go immediately after her. But dire revenge, which was now 1,000 times more fierce in his soul than before, prevents him, and he would cry out, "No! Since I have sacrificed Emoinda to my revenge, shall I lose that glory which I have purchased so dear as the price of the fairest, dearest, softest creature that ever nature made? No! No!" Then at her name, grief would get the ascendant of rage, and he would lie down by her side, and water her face with showers of tears, which never were wont to fall from those eyes. And however bent he was on his intended slaughter, he had not power to stir from the sight of this dear object, now more beloved and more adored than ever. He remained in this deplorable condition for 2 days, and never rose from the ground where he had made her sad sacrifice. At last, rousing from her side, and accusing himself of living too long, now Emoinda was dead, and that the deaths of those barbarous enemies were deferred too long, he resolved now to finish the great work. But offering to rise, he found his strength so decayed that he swayed to and fro, like bows assailed by contrary winds, so that he was forced to lie down again and try to summon all his courage to his aid. He found his brains turned round, and his eyes were dizzy, and objects appeared not the same to him they were wont to do. His breath was short, and all his limbs surprised with a faintness he had never felt before. He had not eat in 2 days, which was one occasion of his feebleness, but excess of grief was the greatest. Yet still he hoped he should never recover vigour to act his design, and lay expecting it yet 6 days longer, still mourning over the dead idol of his heart, and striving every day to rise, but could not. In all this time, you may believe, we were in no little affliction for Caesar and his wife. Some were of opinion he was escaped, never to return. Others thought some accident had happened to him, but however, we failed not to send out 100 people several ways to search for him. A party of about 40 went that way he took, among whom was Tuscan, who was perfectly reconciled to Behn. They had not gone very far into the wood, but they smelt an unusual smell, as of a dead body, for stinks must be very noisome that can be distinguished among such a quality of natural sweets as every inch of that land produces. So that they concluded they should find him dead, or some body that was so. They passed on towards it, as loathsome as it was, and made such rustling among the leaves that lie thick on the ground, by continual falling, that Caesar heard he was approached, and though he had during the space of these 8 days endeavoured to rise, but found he wanted strength, yet looking up and seeing his pursuers, he rose and reeled to a neighbouring tree, against which he fixed his back. And being within a dozen yards of those that advanced and saw him, he called out to them and bid them approach no nearer if they would be safe, so that they stood still, and hardly believing their eyes that would persuade them that it was Caesar that spoke to him, so much was he altered. They asked him what he had done with his wife, for they smelt a stink that almost struck them dead. He, pointing to the dead body, sighing, cried, "Behold her there!" They put off the flowers that covered her with their sticks, and found she was killed, and cried out, "O monster that hast murdered thy wife!" Then asking him why he did so cruel a deed, he replied, he had no leisure to answer impertinent questions. "You may go back," continued he, "and tell the faithless governor he may thank fortune that I am breathing my last, and that my arm is too feeble to obey my heart in what it had designed him." But his tongue faltering and trembling, he could scarce end what he was saying. The English, taking advantage of his weakness, cried, "Let us take him alive by all means." He heard him, and as if he had revived from a fainting or a dream, he cried out, "No, gentlemen, you are deceived. You will find no more Caesars to be whipped. No more find a faith in me, feeble as you think me. I have strength yet left to secure me from a second indignity." They swore all anew, and he only shook his head and beheld them with scorn. Then they cried out, "Who will venture on this single man? Will nobody?" They stood all silent, while Caesar replied, "Fatal will be the attempt to the first adventurer. Let him assure himself." And at that word held up his knife in a menacing posture. "Look ye faithless crew," said he. "'Tis not life I seek, nor am I afraid of dying." And at that word cut a piece of flesh from his own throat, and threw it at him. "Yet still I would live if I could, till I had perfected my revenge. But oh, it cannot be. I feel life gliding from my eyes and heart, and if I make not haste, I shall fall a victim to the shameful whip." At that, he ripped up his own belly and took his bowels and pulled them out, with what strength he could, while some on their knees imploring, besought him to hold his hand. But when they saw him tottering, they cried out, "Will none venture on him?" A bold Englishman cried, "Yes, if he were the devil," taking courage when he saw him almost dead, and swearing a horrid oath for his farewell to the world, he rushed on him. Caesar with his armed hand met him so fairly as stuck him to the heart, and he fell dead at his feet. Tuscan, seeing that, cried out, "I love thee, O Caesar, and therefore will not let thee die if possible," and running to him, took him in his arms, but at the same time, warding a blow that Caesar made at his bosom, he received it quite through his arm, and Caesar, having not the strength to pluck the knife forth, though he attempted it, Tuscan neither pulled it out himself, nor suffered it to be pulled out, but came down with it sticking in his arm. And the reason he gave for it was because the air should not get into the wound. They put their hands across and carried Caesar between 6 of them, fainting as he was. And though they thought dead or just dying, and they brought him to Parham and laid him on a couch and had the chirurgeon immediately to him, who dressed his wounds and sewed up his belly and used means to bring him to life, which they effected. We ran all to see him, and if before we thought him so beautiful a sight, he was now so altered that his face was like a death's head blacked over, nothing but teeth and eye holes. For some days we suffered nobody to speak to him, but caused cordials to be poured down his throat, which sustained his life, and in 6 or 7 days he recovered his senses. For you must know that wounds are almost to a miracle cured in the Indies, unless wounds in the legs, which they rarely ever cure. When he was well enough to speak, we talked to him and asked him some questions about his wife and the reasons why he killed her, and he then told us what I have related of that resolution and of his parting, and he besought us we would let him die, and was extremely afflicted to think it was possible he might live. He assured us if we did not dispatch him, he would prove very fatal to a great many. We said all we could to make him live, and gave him new assurances, but he begged we would not think so poorly of him, or of his love to Emoinda, to imagine we could flatter him to life again. But the chirurgeon assured him he could not live, and therefore he need not fear. We were all, but Caesar, afflicted at this news, and the sight was ghastly. His discourse was sad, and the earthy smell about him was so strong that I was persuaded to leave the place for some time, being myself very sickly and very apt to fall into fits of dangerous illness upon any extraordinary melancholy. The servants and Treefry and the chirurgeons promised all to take what possible care they could of the life of Caesar, and I, taking boat, went with other company to Colonel Martin's, about 3 days' journey down the river. But I was no sooner gone than the governor, taking Treefry about some pretended earnest business a day's journey up the river, having communicated his design to one Bannister, a wild Irishman, and one of the council, a fellow of absolute barbarity and fit to execute any villainy, but rich, he came up to Parham and forcibly took Caesar and had him carried to the same post where he was whipped, and causing him to be tied to it and a great fire made before him, he told him he should die like a dog, as he was. Caesar replied, this was the first piece of bravery that ever Bannister did, and he never spoke sense till he pronounced that word, and if he would keep it, he would declare in the other world that he was the only man of all the whites that ever he heard speak truth. And turning to the men that had bound him, he said, my friends, am I to die or to be whipped? And they cried, whipped! No, you shall not escape so well. And then he replied, smiling, a blessing on thee, and assured them they need not tie him, for he would stand fixed like a rock, and endure death so as should encourage them to die. But if you whip me, said he, be sure you tie me fast. He had learned to take tobacco, and when he was assured he should die, he desired they would give him a pipe in his mouth, ready lighted, which they did. And the executioner came and first cut off his members, and threw them into the fire. After that, with an ill-favoured knife, they cut off his ears and his nose and burned them. He still smoked on, as if nothing had touched him. Then they hacked off one of his arms, and still he bore up and held his pipe. But at the cutting off the other arm, his head sunk, and his pipe dropped, and he gave up the ghost without a groan or a reproach. My mother and sister were by him all the while, but not suffered to save him. So rude and wild were the rabble, and so inhuman were the justices who stood by to see the execution, who after paid dearly enough for their insolence. They cut Caesar in quarters and sent them to several of the chief plantations. One quarter was sent to Colonel Martin, who refused it, and swore he had rather see the quarters of Bannister and the governor himself than those of Caesar on his plantations, and that he could govern his negroes without terrifying and grieving them with frightful spectacles of a mangled king. Thus died this great man, worthy of a better fate, and a more sublime wit than mine to write his praise. Yet I hope the reputation of my pen is considerable enough to make his glorious name to survive all the ages, with that of the brave, the beautiful, and the constant Emoinda. The End.